whether Russia wants to stop escalation or not. This is psychologically important, not for the Ukrainian people, but also for the people of Europe, because I know that the Russian people doesn't want to fight against Ukraine and die. But there are some people who are eager to start a war. Last year when Ukraine carried out military exercises near the Ukrainian border, they started that they would withdraw the troops, but then they returned the troops to the border. This is an element of psychological warfare. We see some rotation of the troops, but I cannot answer your question. Definitely, I cannot definitely tell you that Russia has withdrawn troops. Thank you very much. The conference.
All right, this is live from Kiev, Ukraine. We've just heard from Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky saying that in order to diminish the Russian risk, they need to have a strong army and stand their own. We also know that they are in alliance with the UK, Poland as well. And importantly, Boris Johnson saying that should there be an invasion, this will be a military.
Discussion here at the OSCE, where we had the chairperson in office propose an enhanced European security discussion, but we haven't really gotten into the meat of it yet. And so we need to get down to brass tacks. We need to start to discuss details of military transparency and confidence building and risk reduction and those sorts of measures. And we haven't even really begun yet. So we have to give the process a chance.
The OSCE has a lot of experience in the field, whether it's monitoring elections, whether it's checking out what's happening on borders in disputed situations. President Putin has had several discussions, at least with President Macron. And in the last one, the French readout from Paris was, to my mind, kind of significant. And he's also spoken in Moscow today while he's meeting with the Hungarian Prime Minister. But in Paris, he told President Macron that he was not looking for confrontation. Do you agree that they are not looking for confrontation as we would understand it, i.e. invasion or that kind of thing? And why do you think they're moving things like, or at least the West says, supply lines of, ammunition and blood and the kind of stuff that you might need if you're actually involved in a military confrontation at that border?
Well, Christian, I think you've put your finger on it. We are not going to look at words, we're going to look at deeds. And in terms of what we see in terms of Russian actions, we see this unprecedented buildup, and as you've said, a surge of ammunition, of blood, of other types of enablers to the Russian border with Ukraine that would all be necessary and seem poised for an imminent invasion. And so we don't know what President Putin's calculations are. We don't know what his intentions are. It may be that he does not seek confrontation, but militarily, he is showing us that he is. And so we need to have a discussion and offer that possibility for having real diplomacy take root here so that we can avoid a military escalation. But it is very difficult to speak to his intentions.
Meantime, in the weeks in which this has become front page news, that the NATO allies have stood firmly, that a huge amount of stern threats are coming out from the NATO alliance, it seems in unity, should Russia invade a sovereign country. The president of Ukraine himself, the country in question, has pleaded with you all not to keep up this hype about war. He's talked about, it affecting the economy and other such things. But I wonder if he's also worried that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is what the Russian ambassador to the UN said to the Security Council yesterday.
Listen, please.
They themselves are whipping up tension and rhetoric and are provoking escalation. The discussions about the threat of war is provocative in and of itself. You're almost calling for this. You want it to happen. You're waiting for it to happen, as if you want to make your words become a reality.
I mean, it's a valid point, isn't it, Ambassador, that the more it gets hyped in public, the more, in this case, potentially, Putin's back gets stuck to the wall, and it becomes potentially a very dangerous dynamic. What do you make of that, and how do you react to the Russian ambassador's comment?
Well, look, I think it's absurd to claim that we should remain silent about this massive buildup of aircraft and helicopters and troops and tanks.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting silent, but I've heard the president and his Secretary of State and many others just keep saying it's imminent, it's going to happen, we see it. And even in his press conference, President Biden said that he thinks potentially Putin has to, quote unquote, do something. I'm just wondering about that kind of rhetoric.
Look, I think there's a fine line between warning about what is possible and what could well be imminent based on all the things that we're seeing across a variety of different domains. But then, we've been very clear, I think very consistent with our NATO allies and partners, that we much prefer to see both the Russian side and the other side pursue the path of diplomacy and de-escalation. So we've been very clear. We don't seek to panic anyone. We don't seek to stir trouble. But we do want to avoid a situation where we have a sudden military escalation. And the way to do that is to telegraph, on the one hand, that there will be severe consequences if we go down that path of military escalation, and at the same time to offer an alternative, which is diplomacy and de-escalation with very specific proposals as to what we could do together. And so we're trying to flesh out those proposals right now. As I said, here at the OSCE, we've just begun the process of fleshing it out. So I would ask our Russian partners to bear with us and work with us on fleshing out what we could do together to de-escalate tensions.
So some analysts have obviously pointed out the rather, ignoble memory of the U.S. insistence at the Security Council that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which then led to a war, and then there were no weapons of mass destruction. Some are saying, what about the U.S. and the allies' credibility in this case? Does that concern you at all as you try to put your very serious point of a united front against an invasion that would violate international law? Do you worry about the past and what Russia may be taking from that?
Look, we could go way back into the past. I don't think it's useful for anyone to relitigate that. But let's take a look at very recent history. In 2008, we had Russia complaining about a supposed provocation and threat from Georgia, and then using the guise of a massive troop buildup and exercise on the Georgian border, we had Russia invade militarily in 2008. The same thing in 2014, where under the guise of a large-scale military exercise, we had so-called little green men invade and occupy Crimea. So I think the recent past signals that we have to take this sort of a troop buildup and the bellicose rhetoric that goes along with it. Let's not forget that the Kremlin is talking about Ukraine as if it were not a sovereign state entitled to be able to make its own foreign policy decisions. So when you combine those things, it does paint a picture of a very dire threat. Now, again, let's hope that we don't end up in a military escalation. We very much are trying to pursue the path of having a conversation with the Russians about what are their legitimate security concerns. So let's have the conversation.
And so the flip side of my previous question then would be what you've just mentioned. Potentially Putin saw that the West, talked a good game over both Georgia and Crimea, but didn't do a huge amount about it. Are you convinced now that the West's position is united, no matter what, and is very serious should Putin, again, invade a sovereign country?
Yes, I am. And here at the OSCE, we have 57 participating states, all of the countries of NATO, all of the countries of the EU, and every other country in Europe and Eurasia, to include all of the former states of the Soviet Union. And I think we are united here in saying, look, if you want to talk about military transparency, if you want to talk about reciprocal restraints, risk reduction, that's what we do here at the OSCE. We have the military experts to have this conversation here. So let's have it. But what we're seeing in terms of rhetoric and in terms of the buildup is not consonant with the very core principles that actually the Russian side likes to cite itself, which is the inviolability of borders, respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity. We very much value those principles, but we want the other side to show that they value them too.
Just because you mentioned the OSCE, just give me, if you can, a précis of your advantage on the ground. What is it that you do that can give you eyes and ears and potential, avenues to solutions that might not be available to other institutions?
Well, the OSCE is the largest regional security organization in the world. We have almost 1,500 special monitors in Ukraine as part of a mission to provide transparency into what is happening around the line of contact in the Donbass. The OSCE is also a signatory to the Minsk agreements that offer a pathway to resolving the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, also signatories to those agreements. And the OSCE sits in some of the so-called trilateral contact group. It's essentially a diplomatic grouping that discusses security and humanitarian issues. So there is a pathway that the OSCE is very central, as a central player in, that would see us implementing a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. But it takes the Russian side to be able to sign up and implement its side of the agreements, which are ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and allowing the OSCE full access to Ukrainian territory. If we can move down that path, then we can start to resolve the conflict.
Let me just read you a little bit from what Foreign Minister Lavrov said recently in an interview, and he quoted and spoke about precisely your organization, the OSCE, quite copiously. He said in 2010 in Astana, and before that in 1999 in Istanbul, all presidents and prime ministers from the OSCE countries signed a package that contained interrelated principles to ensure the indivisibility of security. Then he says the West ripped out just one slogan from this package. Each country has the right to choose its allies and military alliances. But in that package, this right comes with a condition and an obligation on each country to which the Westerners subscribe, i.e., not to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others. That seems to be the fundamental issue at play here.
Look, Christiana, we couldn't agree anymore that no state should undertake actions that undermine the security of another state. I would point to the Russian invasion of Georgia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2008 and 2014 as examples of where that principle is undermined. But, I mean, if taken to an extreme and ridiculous extent, then no state could take any action in any foreign policy sphere if it was not consonant with the desires of its neighbors. Clearly, every state has a right to take decisions that are its sovereign right in terms of its foreign policy. But no state can violate another state's borders. No state can surge troops into another state and occupy a piece of its territory. So we very much agree with the principles that Foreign Minister Lavrov has set forth that were agreed at the head of state level in 2010 and in 1999 in those documents that you cited. But we just think that precisely those commitments need to be implemented in full. And we see the Russian side as not having done that in the recent past. So let's sit down, let's talk about these commitments, and let's strengthen them rather than try to dilute them or use language that pretends that we're not abiding by them, because we are.
And finally, at the OSCE headquarters back in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum was signed, in which Russia signed, the US signed, France and the UK signed, to respect and to guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity in return for Ukraine handing over its nuclear weapons. It had a huge stockpile, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, it handed them over and gave them to Russia, but in return for not being invaded. What do the Russians, what do your interlocutors say when you raise that? I mean, why don't they respect that treaty?
Well, we keep raising this point over and over. I mean, if Foreign Minister Lavrov and his colleagues in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs want to talk about some of these principles that we just discussed, that no state should take an action that undermine the security of another state, Here you have Ukraine in 1994 giving up its nuclear stockpile in return for guarantees as to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And those were brutally violated in 2014 and remain violated to this day. We've had more than 14,000 casualties, more than 14,000 killed in eastern Ukraine as a result of this ongoing war. And so we would ask the Russian side to please abide by those commitments that they freely undertook in the 1990s and even since in the 2010s. So the question is for them. You know, you cite these principles, but you don't live up to them. So let's talk about how we can better implement the documents and the declarations and principles.
Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Turning now to Myanmar, and today marks the one-year anniversary of the coup that saw the military junta seize control there. De facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi was ousted and detained. In early January, she was sentenced to another 4 years in prison. On the eve of the anniversary, the US, the UK, and Canada hit top officials with new sanctions, with President Biden blasting unspeakable violence against civilians. The junta has spent the past year trying to squash resistance, but it's stronger than ever. In a moment, we'll talk to one of the opposition leaders. But first, correspondent Ivan Watson shows us how the opposition has gone from peaceful to armed. And here's the report he filed back in September.
7 months after the military overthrew Myanmar's elected government, resistance to the junta has grown increasingly violent. The opposition waging a campaign of bombings, assassinations, and infrastructure sabotage. Destroying cell phone towers, for example, apparently belonging to a telecommunications company partly owned by the Myanmar military.
Have you yourself planted any bombs?
Yes, a couple of times.
This man, who asks not to be identified, once organized peaceful anti-military protests, but now calls himself a guerrilla fighter.
It used to be holding protest signboards. Now it's about using explosives, sometimes even guns for our own safety.
Any of you have...
In fact, when I first interviewed him in March, he rejected violence.
Do you support violent attacks on the military?
No, not at all.
For weeks after the February 1st coup, opposition demonstrators staged colorful, peaceful protests. But the military cracked down hard, shooting at protesters by day, arresting them in their homes at night. As the death toll swelled to estimates of more than 1,100, the once peaceful protester says he embraced armed resistance.
I'm no longer the same person I was before. And it's just about 6 months ago. And I think that applies for everyone in this country.
The army general who declared himself Myanmar's ruler calls the insurgents terrorists.
Extremists and their supporters chose the act of terrorism instead of doing or solving it in line with the law. They incited anarchy and committed armed insurrection.
Military-run media claim the opposition carried out more than 2,000 bomb attacks and killed nearly 800 people in the last 7 months. On September 7th, Myanmar's opposition government in exile endorsed the many small cells of armed resistance that have cropped up, calling on them to attack the military regime.
This is a war because our military created a war.
Until late February, Ni Tuta was a captain in the Myanmar military, but he says the slaughter of civilians pushed him to defect.